Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. This year marks 25 years since some 50,000 people showed up in Seattle to protest world leaders who were meeting as part of the World Trade Organization. It was a week-long protest, and its reverberations were felt immediately, in the anti-war movement just after 9/11, and later with protests such as Occupy Wall Street, and even today with protests against U.S. support for Israel's assault on Gaza. Today we're going to be in conversation about this history, about the protest in Seattle specifically, which is commonly known as the Battle in Seattle. In fact, there was even a documentary film about it by such name. My guest for this is D.W. Gibson. D.W. Gibson is a veteran reporter and author, and he's the author of a new book called 1 Week to Change the World, an oral history of the 1999 WTO protest. D.W. Gibson, it is my good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Remind me what's happening in the world in 1999. I wasn't in Seattle in 99. I obviously remember it. But what's going on? What's the WTO and what's on the agenda for the WTO when these world leaders meet in 99 in Seattle?
Yeah, and that sort of front part of that question was really interesting because what's going on in the world? I mean, it's important to sort of re-immerse ourselves in 1999. It was a really particular year, end of the decade of the 90s, which I think we're sort of still wrestling with today in terms of the consequences. But that end came with such punctuation because I would describe it as a time of great excitement and anxiety, this real mixture. We can't forget about Y2K, right? This idea that all of the computer systems might be doomed because of the two-digit misinterpretation of a new millennium. There were fight clubs breaking out across the country, right? That sort of energy was in the air, I think.
Because of that movie? Because of the movie Fight Club?
Yeah. The movie came out around then, and it's even referenced by a few folks in the book who encountered it just around the time of the protests. And I think that sort of, I mention that because I think that sort of, I think a lot of the energy that drives a fight club, sort of the sort of angst and excitement for life, I think sort of is captured in the moment of these protests. And the WTO, at that point, the World Trade Organization, was really, really young, had just been around for a few years in terms of its formal founding. And they had a very clear objective in Seattle. After they had been sort of officially founded, had charter members across the world that sort of joined the organization, they wanted to increase their power. They wanted to reach a much broader, bigger agreement that would govern how international trade happens. And that riled a lot of people because the WTO was pursuing power where, say, hey, listen, United States, if you want to say that we don't want child labor involved in making products, you can't do that. That's illegal. That's a trade barrier, right? If you want to make sure that this product doesn't harm the environment when it's made, you can't do that. That's illegal. That's a trade barrier. So it's just sort of really a fight between democracy, people who saw their rights as towns and cities and states and as a country to make democratic rules and laws, those being overridden, or at least WTO trying to override those with its authority to govern international trade. Really sort of these early days of globalization, right? What is it going to look like?
Such an interesting time, even for the president at the time of this country, Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton is right around the time of facing impeachment over his affair and how he handled the affair with Monica Lewinsky. And it's a moment in which actually the impeachment trial and the efforts to try to dethrone him make him wildly popular in this country. Yet at the same time, there is growing consternation from the left about Bill Clinton, because of course this is now 5 years after the signing of NAFTA. 4 or 5 years after NAFTA, yeah.
Yeah, and that's the prelude, right? NAFTA. That's where I think what you have with Clinton and the Clinton administration is this shift away from FDR New Deal type approach to governing, and Clinton bringing the Democratic Party into sort of the Reagan space, right, the Republican space, to try to win the White House. And this is why he was largely successful, but it was so largely disappointing as we sort of get more distance from it, right, because we realize that move had so many harmful effects. And 50,000 people in Seattle, one of the biggest, some of the largest groups of people. There were so many different stakeholders and individuals and small organizations that came together. But some of the biggest stakeholders that were involved in all of the organizing, all the protests, were unions, specifically Teamsters, AFL-CIO, right? Steelworkers. And these were people that had already experienced some of the effects of NAFTA and realized that this approach to globalization that was really corporate governance, really corporations making these rules at the expense of civil society, that was riling a lot of people. That's how you get environmentalists marching with Teamsters, right? You get this really broad coalition. And I think it's important too to note that many of the protesters that were there work hard to emphasize, look, this wasn't necessarily an anti-globalization protest. This was a pro-democracy protest, right? Part of the upset was that civil society, NGOs, and other organizations that weren't corporations and that weren't government officials were being squeezed out of the process of this rulemaking, and they were ostensibly supposed to be involved in it, but really it boiled down to a few key governments making a lot of the decisions.
How does the word go out about this? How does this start to form? The protests and the organizing around the protests. You just don't turn, I mean, it's got to be a major event to turn 50,000 people to a particular place.
Yeah, that's a great question because it was such an exciting time that way, right? So we're a few years into this thing called the internet, right? Cell phones are out in the world, but not smartphones, right? So we're in the sort of flip phone world. We're in those sort of old Motorola two-way radio phones, if you remember those sort of coming into popularity. So there are a lot of devices that are really new and that can be used, but it's not sort of the way we think about it now, right? So internet was there to help, but it was email, right? It was listservs. It was very rudimentary tools, 1.0, right? But they were huge. That was huge because you could upload flyers and broadsheets and get word out about opportunities to carpool with someone to Seattle, a place to stay in Seattle, right? So much of that could be facilitated over listservs and email. And that was real, those tools were really harnessed by the organizers. But it's important also, I think, at the same time to understand that it wasn't some wholesale transformation, right? There were still road trips, right? People going on into different regions of the country, barnstorming, really, doing teach-ins, doing events to drum up interest and enthusiasm for people to come to Seattle. And I think that that's important to note because that hybrid, that sort of combination of utilizing what was newly available with the internet, but also realizing it was still important to get in the same space with people, to talk to people face to face. I think it's a little bit of something that's been lost 25 years on. And we've come to look at sort of organizing as something that can happen entirely online. And there's some downfalls to that.
Who's doing the barnstorming? And I ask this because you have very diverse groups coming to Seattle to protest, right? Everything from labor to environmentalists and sort of everything in between.
Yeah, you had different groups barnstorming. So you had United Steelworkers were locked out of the Kaiser plant where they were working. So they had plenty of time on their hands and they had a roadshow going. David Solnit, a major organizer in the Bay Area who started Arts and Revolution with Dana Scherholz. He took a show on the road and he's famous for making these big 15-foot puppets and bringing a lot of culture and theater and levity to very serious organizing. And he brought that energy and that sort of presentation to a roadshow he put together, brought along people like Chia Bod from the Philippines, who had a harrowing experience working in a sweatshop in Saipan and had uncovered what she experienced there and fled the country and was living in California at the time and working with a few NGOs to get that message out, to start the No Sweat movement, to move institutions and schools and police departments to buy clothes that weren't produced in sweatshops. So, and she was a part of those roadshows to tell her story, to tell people what she had experienced is one of the effects of globalization. So yeah, a range of people out there talking to the people they felt they could connect with. And unions too. Ron Judd was AFL-CIO representative in Seattle, really one of the driving forces behind this action. He was out talking to people as well. So, that's important, right? It's different people talking to different demographics, to talking to the people with whom they could connect.
How organized is it? Is it centrally organized?
So no, it is not at all centrally organizing. The organizing here is so uh, accomplished. I think that's the word I would use for it. So you had two main things going on, and I think it's important, like I said earlier, so many stakeholders, right? There were so many ways in to care about what the WTO is doing. You care about the environment, you want to stop the WTO. You care about sweatshops, you want to stop the WTO. You care about unions, right? So many different ways. You care about debt relief, right? You had a Catholic priest there marching side by side with anarchists, right? So you had so many stakeholders, and with that, different approaches to organizing. And I think one of the sort of major dividing lines, if you will, or sort of contours to everyone that came together is defined by this sort of this two different spaces. One was sort of the NGO crowd, the DC crowd, people that worked with people like Ralph Nader and Public Citizen, big organizations that brought money and resources and connections. Sierra Club, these sort of organizations we all might recognize. They were there and they had a presence, right? But there were also small, really informal collectives from across the country. There were individual players who were sort of backpack activists traveling around the country and wanting to get involved in different ways, right? Didn't really come with an official affiliation. So you had this sort of very official NGO, DC based part of the organizing, and then this sort of more loose affiliation of organizations and individuals. And that loose affiliation really did take shape. It became something known as the Direct Action Network, where they brought together everyone come into this big sort of car, so to speak, right? Everyone pile in, we'll work together, right? And they rented a warehouse in downtown Seattle. They called it the Convergence Space. I think this is really important because they had this physical space to go to find a place to stay in Seattle, to get training, to get food, to get rest, to meet comrades. So it's very important, that space, the convergence space, and the Direct Action Network worked out of that space in large part. And everyone organized into what they called affinity groups, groups of 15 or 20 people that felt like they were on the same page in terms of how they wanted to approach protesting, right? And so they would talk about for weeks and weeks and months how they were going to go about protesting as a group of individuals that were building trust together. And all those affinity groups would come together in something called the Spokes Council at the Convergence Center, where they had each one representative that would sort of speak on behalf of the group and communicate concerns and desires about how they wanted to see the protests go down. So you had this sort of very, very decentralized approach to organizing, but yet very, very structured at the same time so that things could move forward, so the action could move forward, and there could be a clear plan to go about their goal, which was, of course, to shut down the meeting. It's really important to point out that they had a very clear, singular goal, which was to put thousands of bodies in the street to block 13 intersections so that WTO delegates couldn't get to the convention center and couldn't hold their meetings. And they achieved that goal. They achieved that goal, and the WTO had to walk away without an agreement. And I think that's really important to underscore, because how many protests state a goal and achieve that goal? It's quite rare, actually.
They knew these particular 13 intersections were key towards shutting down that meeting?
Yes, so there were different venues where a few things were happening for the meetings, but the central location was the convention center. And there are a few images throughout the book, and one of them is my absolute favorite. It's a map of Seattle, and the protesters very early got this map of Seattle, and they divided it up into 13 sort of pie wedges, they called them. And so the affinity groups were assigned to pie wedge A, pie wedge B, right? You're in charge of blocking these intersections, right? We don't care how you go about doing it, but you block these intersections, right? So it's very organized in terms of who would be where. And again, those groups went about it in different ways. Some were quite militant. They had sort of lock boxes, these sort of metal or plastic pipes where they can interlock their arms and can't be torn asunder without saws. There were groups of families, marching bands, all kinds of tactics employed in terms of how to go about blocking the intersection. The only rules really were that it happened non-violently. And that was the commitment that everyone who participated in the direct action, they made that commitment.
There was a contingency of a black bloc, was there not? So how did that work into the commitment of nonviolence?
Yeah, so the black bloc is sort of a loose term that's used for an action, a group of people that want to come together and cover their faces with masks and engage in vandalism to make their voices heard. This wasn't something that was endorsed by the vast majority of the protesters. I think this part of the story is actually really about the media. And it's one of the ways we see reverberations today in a very, very strong way. So you had 50,000 people. And, I talked to a lot of the protesters that were there. I talked to law enforcement, city officials, governor at the time. Everyone pretty much agrees that max, we're talking in terms of that black bloc contingent that decided to smash up windows at Starbucks and Nike Town and so forth. We're talking maximum 50 people. Right, 50 people out of 50,000 people. And these are 50 people that weren't engaged at the Convergence Center, right? They weren't engaged with the Direct Action Network because they didn't want to engage that kind of vandalism. They wanted to keep it peaceful and nonviolent toward human beings, and also nonviolent in terms of no vandalism. So I think that's
no vandalism was part of the commitment, because people will say, well, vandalism isn't violence. I mean, it's a debatable thing.
Yeah, and this word violence is where you see a lot of this sort of, I think a lot of the upset between the communication that had happened between law enforcement and protesters, because law enforcement absolutely defined vandalism as violence. And the protesters did too, even though they drew a distinction, they didn't endorse it. I think two things happened at once. They want to say, hey, look, they're not hurting people, but also we don't endorse that. But the way that I think it's about the media is the fact that once the Black Bloc started doing their thing on the sort of major day of the protest, that Tuesday, it was all the headlines, right? And so the story shifted from being about democracy, how we're going about globalization, big issues, big, really sweeping issues, to 50 people smashing windows at Starbucks. That's an entirely different story. They're both real stories. But here we run into the media's incapacity to tell two stories at once, right? And more to the point, I talked again to not only to protesters, but law enforcement, who confirmed that not only did some protesters link arms to protect some of the big stores that were getting windows smashed. By the way, protesters who did not want to be protecting places like Nike Town had lots of gripes with Nike Town, but didn't agree with the vandalism, right? They linked arms and protected those stores. The next day, several protesters the next morning came out with brooms and trash bags and swept up a lot of the mess, right? But you didn't see those pictures in the newspapers or online. You didn't hear those stories. Those don't make for captivating stories right away, right? But those things happened. And I think that this is something that was really a big part of, if you will, sort of the inheritance of Seattle, the lessons learned of Seattle's is the media and their treatment of the action. We've seen this in the Gaza protests. I was at the Columbia campus, I remember one evening, and there are a couple of hot spots where there's a lot of energy and maybe some loud conversations taking place back and forth. That's where all the reporters are. But then you have everyone else sitting in tents, walking around, reading books, talking quietly to each other, eating, laughing, listening to music, right? But that stuff doesn't get covered, and we misrepresent the overall activity and energy of a protest often in how it's portrayed in media.
Yeah, this is a dynamic we see again and again. Now, local authorities basically ran out of tear gas by day 2 of this week, right? So who are they using the tear gas on? What's going on between protesters at large and the police?
Yeah, so I think, again, one of the other key sort of parts of the Seattle legacy is the militarization of police departments. And the Seattle PD had been getting some information from police departments, law enforcement officials, I should say, in Europe, that it had protest over the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank in the previous year. And they'd had large-scale protests like they saw in Seattle. And those officers had adopted practices of wearing sort of these Ninja Turtle outfits, right, with all the knee pads and shoulder pads and elbow pads. And that really sort of amped up presentation on the streets. And Seattle's the first time we really see the modern version of that in a U.S. context. And when we talk about law enforcement in Seattle, I think it's really important to peel back sort of the layers of the onion and understand we're talking about a lot of agencies. Yes, the Seattle PD had primary responsibility, but there was also the the sheriff's office involved. There was also the Washington State Troopers involved. Because Bill Clinton was going to be there,
Yeah,
the
you have world
FBI
leaders
was
there.
involved.
You probably have
Yeah,
everyone
world
involved.
leaders. Yes, yeah. So FBI was involved in the planning. Secret Service was involved in planning. So
Oh,
I think it's
gosh.
important to acknowledge all these layers of law enforcement. And we can put a pin in that and set it aside. But is that necessary? My God. But what you have within all of those layers is disagreement, right? You have different personalities and different takes about how aggressive to be. And it's important to note that the mayor of Seattle at the time, Paul Schell, who's now deceased, and the chief of police, Norm Stamper, who's still around, they really were quite liberal in their approach to this, and they supported the WTO coming to Seattle. They wanted to find a way to make that work, but they also really wanted to give protesters space to do their thing. And Norm Stamper, the chief of police, I think he's a really important character here because in the end, he came to confess that his heart was really more with the protesters.
Yeah.
He didn't want to enforce any kind of restrictions on them. And he really abdicated his responsibilities. And, Norm's very clear on this, and he's spent his life since Seattle trying to get police reformed, and he's made a lot of enemies within law enforcement at this point. But so Norm is sort of abdicating his position, and then so you have a vacuum there where you have the sheriff David Reichart, who's incidentally now running for governor in Washington, and you have the State Patrol and FBI really sort of stepping in. When the first couple of days they saw just how big the protests were and just how successful they were being at blocking entrance to the convention center, they realized we've got to step this up and we've got to step this up quickly if we're going to clear them out of the streets and get these meetings going in any way, shape, or form. And so they became really, really aggressive. Yeah. And blew through tear gas and pepper spray, both, right? Tear gas are more sort of for broad application to disperse crowds. Pepper spray sprayed directly into people's eyes. They ran out on the first full day of protest, which was a Tuesday, and the FBI had to fly in from Colorado new supplies of tear gas so they could continue to use it throughout the week.
Are the world leaders already there when
They
this
were
all
there,
starts off?
yeah. They got there over the weekend. So these protests take place over a week, and everyone is sort of getting to town the weekend before the week starts on that Sunday. And one big wild card too was you had delegates from all over the world, and some of them had their own security. They all had their own security detail. So there were incidents too where delegates were trying to make their way to the convention center, and their own security detail brandished firearms, right? It's still to this day, I don't know how we didn't have any death. I don't know how anyone didn't die. It's still quite remarkable that's the case because you had so many precarious situations where that was a very real possibility.
Is force mostly being used to try to clear people out?
Yes, at first it was used sort of without purpose, without clarity. There was one intersection, but yes, that was the main goal. And then they had started at one intersection sort of haphazardly. But when Reichard and the sheriff's office really took over, and the state patrol, they developed a plan to go intersection by intersection, trying to clear people out. And, two factors here. One is the geography of Seattle. It really is sort of a fishbowl. You have the water on one side, you have Capitol Hill going up into elevation on the other side. So you really have this one tight area that's contained. And I don't think that you could design a way to surround a building so easily in other cities. Really, the geography helped out the protesters here in a major way. And that was a major factor to their ability to sort of block those intersections.
So what are world leaders doing as this is all happening? Do they ever get to meet? Are they just hanging out in the hotel? I mean, I'm sure there's different stories for different people, but generally speaking, what's
Yeah,
going on?
yeah. There were a lot of good stories on this front. I mean, the U.S. contingency that was there, Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State, was there. Lots of good sort of animated storytelling about Madeleine Albright in her hotel room. She was unable to get out of there and had a few choice words for the organizers and the governor of Washington with her upset there. So you had a few delegates that were able to sort of muscle their way past protesters into the convention center, but by and large, delegates were not able to make it into the convention center. And the first day of meetings were in fact canceled. They had to cancel them. They couldn't carry them out. Now, the dynamics shifted on the second day of official meetings, and they did, in fact, the police did, in fact, clear intersections and create space, and they created a no protest zone so that the protesters had to be several blocks removed from the convention center. This is standard practice now. They would never let them get as close as they initially did with the protests. And the delegates were able to meet later in the week, but by that point, the effect had been made, right? There was this sort of Lori Wallach, a key organizer there, who's been a big sort of power broker with trade in DC for decades. She really emphasized this sort of inside-outside game, right? So you had 50,000 people in the streets, but you also had a lot of people that were working with the protesters that were in the meetings with the delegates, trying to, as Lori says, monkey wrench things that way, right? And you had members of civil society, especially in Africa and Asia, that were really upset with the WTO. They were part of the proceedings, but they saw the US and the European Union and Canada and Japan, some of the biggest economies, were controlling all of the meetings and the trajectory of the conversations. And so they were feeling empowered, African leaders and leaders from the Caribbean and so forth. They were feeling empowered by what was happening out on the streets. And they began to push back.
So they had allies inside.
Yes, and that's key too. I think that gets lost. That, there was room for, what's your approach? You want to get a seat at the table and try to argue this shouldn't happen? There's space for you to do that. You want to go out into the street and lie down so a car can't pass by? You can do that as well. So different tactics and different approaches for different people. And these different tactics can work in harmony to create a big effect. And that's what they managed to do in Seattle.
So when you say throw a monkey wrench into the process, does this mean that the sort of procedures, they were procedurally able to hold things up?
Yes, yeah. So there was a term, the green room, right? And it was a space that was designated as the green room. And that's where the serious meetings took place, where the director general would be there. But, a lot of the delegates complained, especially again from some of the developing countries, that they had no idea what was happening. Who's in the green room now? Who's going to be in the green room this afternoon? Very bad communication. And so Lori Wallach and other people, Medea Benjamin got inside too. They would sort of stand up on a chair and say, okay, impromptu press conference, let's talk about what's going on, right? And they would sort of try to persuade some of the delegates to hear the points they were making. So in that way, yeah, they were really monkey wrenching things in terms of communication between delegates and even I would say sort of, I don't want to say goodwill, but patience, let's say patience on the part of delegates from developing countries.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with D.W. Gibson. D.W. Gibson is the author of the book, 1 Week to Change the World, an Oral History of the 1999 WTO protests. I want to come back to this direct action network. It sounds like this is the apparatus that is being used to try to bring some governing or order to all of this very large protest that is happening. Are all the groups participating with this? The unions, the environmentalists, the people who are coming from around the world and converging all into Seattle? Is this pretty much a process, I guess, that everyone's participating in?
Most everyone, yeah. With so many people, of course, there was room made for different approaches, and some people took different approaches, but by and large, yes. And people coming from all over the world, like you said, I think that's important to highlight because the US-based protesters, organizers realized that they were taking their cues from the global South. The Korean farmers and Indian farmers. Vandana Shiva was there. José Bouvier, a French farmer who had taken his tractor to a McDonald's they were trying to build in the countryside, he was there. And so US-based protesters were taking their cues from those people, inviting them into the convergence space to participate. And even the sort of affinity group structure that I outlined, the spokes council structure that I outlined, that came from the Spanish Civil War. So you have sort of lineage there. And the fact that they called it the Convergence Center, I think that's important. That word convergence was so crucial. I think it's a place that was meant to be inviting. Lisa Fithian, one of the key organizers, said, today's organizing is a lot about sort of culture of identity. We were trying to create a culture of care. And I think that sort of culture of care was created an inviting atmosphere. Now, there were some points of disharmony. As I mentioned, there's some members of the Black Bloc group that tried to sort of engage the Direct Action Network, but were denied that possibility because they insisted on using vandalism as a tool. And then the unions, I think, were very split, right? There were a lot of sort of rank and file union members who were very into this idea. Yes, let's shut down the meetings, bodies in the street, block the intersections. But when you go back to DC and you talk to union leadership at the time, chiefly John Sweeney at the time, Jimmy Hoffa Jr. Also as well with the Teamsters, there was some hesitancy in terms of, I don't know about shutting down the meeting. You know, we want to march and make some noise, but they had alliances with the Clinton administration. This was a little dicey for them.
Right.
So there was a split there, and there was this really key moment. I got to tell you, you know, this is a really important week, but it's just a damn good story because there's all these moments that are just so electric and read almost like a thriller. And the Direct Action Network was there on this key first day of meetings, trying to keep all those intersections blocked. But, you know, the police are coming hard with the tear gas and the pepper spray, and protesters are trying to hold the line, but they're feeling like it just might not happen. And they look up and they see over the hill just a sea of Teamsters and steelworkers coming down to meet them. And they just had this feeling of, here comes the cavalry, right? And some of the union members, some of the leadership did in fact peel off. They were saying, we're not going to be lying in the street. We're not going to be sitting down in the street and blocking the meetings. But enough of the rank and file said, screw that, we're doing it. We're going all the way and we're going to join them. And that reinforcement was key. Those additional bodies in the street were key just numerically in terms of keeping law enforcement at bay long enough to have them have to cancel the meetings.
That's fascinating. But the leadership of AFL-CIO did not want to shut down the meetings. That was not their goal. They were there. They were concerned about these meetings. They're concerned about what's happening, but they're not trying. But some of their members do. It sounds like many of their members do.
David Solnit described it as the difference between wanting to get a seat at the table and wanting to turn over the table. And I think it's important to note too that John Sweeney, the leader of the AFL-CIO, you know, at the time he after he saw the success of Seattle, he started to engage in more serious direct action planning after that. And Kevin Danaher, who details a great story about a year after Seattle, being in DC with John Sweeney, planning another protest, just like we had in Seattle. And John Sweeney said to him, you know what, this time we're going to do it. We're going to sit down in the street with you and we're going to make this happen. He saw the power of that civil disobedience, of that direct action. Of course, that story gets interrupted by this little event called 9/11, which redirected a lot of the energy.
Yeah, and I'm going to get into that with you and sort of the legacy of it. But you did pique my interest in talking about affinity groups and their connection to the Spanish Civil War.
Yeah, that Hans Schahn and John Sellers, who were in charge of something called the Ruckus Society, which was not an organized organization, but a training organization. They would go around to, say, the timber wars in the Pacific West or nuclear disarmament efforts. Really something that grew out of Greenpeace. When Greenpeace stopped doing its direct action work, John and Han formed Ruckus Society to keep sort of that spirit of direct action going. And they brought that sort of approach to organizing the affinity groups, as did David Solnit, to the work in Seattle. Again, you know, I think it's important to recognize that it's important to look for lineage. It's important to connect dots between movements. I talked to Noam Chomsky in the book, and he says, you know, the U.S., it's always tabula rasa in the U.S. with the left, right? There's no sustained movement. We're always starting over. It's like young people saying, what can we do? Let's just try this. Let's just try that. And there's a breakdown in communication between generations and movements. And here you actually see some connective tissue working well in terms of how to organize in a decentralized way.
I mean, it was just a week. I'm sure there was plenty of work ahead of time. From my own experience covering things as a reporter and protest movement that have happened later afterwards, including the anti-war movement with the invasion of Iraq and Occupy Wall Street. I wasn't in New York, but I was in the Bay Area. We had Occupy Oakland, San Francisco, Berkeley, and we saw the whole dynamic. And it makes me wonder, I mean, the battle, you know, what happened in Seattle, that's a week long. Maybe it's easier to keep things together, and not to say easy, but easier to keep things together and running harmoniously as much as possible compared to something like Occupy Wall Street that went on for months, and then eventually you really see internal divisions form.
Yeah, it's so important what you just said. Absolutely. So, and two things there. One is, yes, so much work. My goodness, so much work. Months and months. That convergence center that they rented in that warehouse, that was rented at least 6 months
Hmm.
before
Who
the
rented it?
protest. It was money coming from a few different sources, and I'm not actually sure whose money was used for that space, but a lot of the money was coming from Public Citizen, Ralph Nader's organization at the time. A lot of the unions were bringing in a lot of money, and then a lot of passing the hat, right? A lot of grassroots sort of mailers sent out, people sending in $25 and that kind of stuff. But months and months of training and organizing, that just can't be said enough, right? You really have to plan and work hard. They even had a training camp where they went up to a farm and taught people how to rappel off of buildings if they wanted to hang banners, and how to resist sort of police brutality and keep your cool, how to get arrested, all of these things, right? So that training was really important to the work that was done. And your comment about this 1 week, this sort of finite space, I think that's crucial, because I think one thing that a lot of really energetic movements and moments suffer from is a lack of clarity when it comes to objectives. And I think that if civil disobedience, if direct action is going to be successful, there are two really important characteristics they must have. One is nonviolence, of course, they must be nonviolent. And two, there have to be clearly articulated strategic goals, tactical goals for practical outcomes, right? Not just media coverage, right? We want to get people's attention and get people talking about this. That's a good goal, but that can't be your only goal. And I think this is what you saw with Occupy, right? Really great energy. A moment was harnessed and seized, and a lot was accomplished in terms of changing national conversation. I think you can argue, like, did we talk about Wall Street the same way before then, right? Did Bernie Sanders have a national platform before then, right? You can point to all those things. Things happened. I don't want to disparage the Occupy movement. I was in the streets of New York, and it was an exciting time. But you didn't have this focus on specific tactical goals. And I think that if I could speak to organizers around the country about anything, it'd be that. How can you go to the pressure points of the power structures you're trying to get at, and disrupt, monkey wrench their actions? And here they discovered they had a very, very, very clear example of how to do that, right? Block 13 intersections and prevent them from meeting at the convention center.
When you talk about the preparation that is put in before the meeting and the protests and the trainings that are occurring, do you know, were authorities know about this? I mean, it makes me think that, it would be prime for infiltration if they took it seriously. Did the government take this seriously ahead of time?
They were very slow to take it seriously. And this goes back to sort of those layers of law enforcement. And Seattle Police Department had the first sort of responsibility in terms of organizing response and preparation for this. And they just weren't realizing, the leadership there, Norm Stamper and so forth, they were not realizing how big this was going to be. Mm-hmm. They had stories about how protests had gone before in Seattle. We've got good communication with protesters. We give them space. And that had all been true, but they didn't realize that this was not your average Seattle protest. Other law enforcement agencies did, and they did have people who infiltrated the organizers. Seattle Police Department, because of city ordinances, was quite hamstrung in how they couldn't do any of the infiltrating, but the sheriff's department could, and they did, and they gained information that way. And so it became about the sheriff's department poking the police department, saying, "Hey, listen up. This is going to be a lot bigger than you think it is." But for months and months, that went back and forth, and it wasn't really until the very last moment that law enforcement and the police department said, "Okay, wait a second. Maybe this is going to be really big." And in fact, they heard about the training camp that had been set up by the protesters at a farm outside of Seattle. And they were all in this very targeted way preparing for the protesters. And so then the police department started doing training camps of their own. I always thought that was kind of remarkable, that, this sort of moment of, oh, we should have training camps too, right? And they engaged a lot of entities, including the Los Angeles Police Department, that was sharing what they had experienced with the police riots and the riots in LA after the Rodney King verdict a few years earlier. You constantly see law enforcement taking counsel from other agencies that have maybe not performed so admirably. It's kind of remarkable that they continue to do that.
Ralph Nader is interesting in this story, and is a name that has come up a few times in our conversation. I suspect many people may not even realize Ralph Nader helped provide resources for the protest in Seattle. And then, do you see a connection between Ralph Nader and what happens in Seattle and his presidential run in 2000?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it is. John Nichols, who I interviewed in the book, he made this point. I think it's really true. He's, Seattle was really the platform that established Ralph Nader's presidential run. The upset and anger and the energy that went in to Seattle in terms of taking a hard look at globalization and what we want it to look like, and who are the stakeholders at the table? Or is the American worker at the table? Or is American civil society at the table? Those were questions that really consumed Ralph Nader. And the energy that was in Seattle, the success of Seattle, is really what drove his presidential campaign, which, as we know, had remarkable implications for the trajectory of American history, right? That small percentage of votes he garnered in Florida and beyond was consequential. And so that's one of many ways you see the long tail of Seattle playing out in American politics.
I mean, it kind of reminds me what maybe Occupy was to Bernie Sanders' run in 2016. You could sort of see what happened in Seattle to Ralph Nader's run in 2000.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think there's lineage between those two, right? Because there is lineage between Occupy and Seattle, right? This sort of upset with corporate governance, right? Sort of democracy cowering in the face of capitalism. Can you not do anything to make this workable for the demos, right? For the people.
And the whole mic check thing, right? Didn't that come from Seattle? When someone would say mic check, and then everyone, because if you didn't have a PA system, everyone else would say mic check, and then a group would repeat what's being said by a single person, so to amplify it for everyone to hear.
Yeah. Something that became very popular in Occupy was actually originated there in Seattle, outside of the county jail in downtown Seattle, where several hundred people were there, and several hundred people were outside the jail in solidarity trying to get them out. They realized they had no way to communicate to each other, such a big crowd outside that jail, and started to use the people's microphone. So just one very specific tactical piece that lives on from Seattle.
You talked to a remarkable amount of people in doing this oral history about what happened in Seattle in 1999. Did you find people, especially among organizers or people who were at least part of the protest, that had regrets about 99?
Yes, absolutely. But, I don't, and I think about it as you ask me, I don't recall anyone having necessarily regrets about the action of the week. I think there's so much pride in terms of what they accomplished, and how they went about it. I think when there's regret, it's about what happened afterward, and the inability or the fact that they weren't able to make this into a lasting movement. And I think there are two reasons for that, and we've touched on both of them, but it's worth underscoring. One of them was 9/11, and something outside of everyone's control that just became a vacuum that sucked up all of the energy that was going into these protests around globalization and put them into the anti-war movement. And but the other factor too was this lack of transference between generations, between movements, and this is where a lot of people expressed regret. David Solnit talked about this really well. Nadine Block talked about it really well. The fact that they didn't do a good job of explaining what they accomplished in Seattle and how they accomplished it in Seattle. And, in this fact that Chomsky touched on, that this is always it's always about starting over with left organizing in the US. And you don't have that in Europe. You have sort of sense of tradition. You have, sort of union halls and guilds and organizing over generations. And you had it with the civil rights movement. Right? We do have American examples, right? Let's remember that in 1963, Bull Connor arrested hundreds of children, right? Because they were out in the streets, because they had been trained and they knew the context because of older generations that had been at it for over, decades at that point. And so that transference of tactics and tools didn't happen. And I think if we could look at the landscape now, and see what was happening on college campuses. Will that survive this summer, right? Will it survive to fall term, those efforts? I hope it does. But one way we can make that happen is sort of this engagement with other movements, with other organizers who have learned hard lessons, who have made mistakes that don't need to be made again. I know we have a lot of sort of intergenerational angst now, a lot of memes around sort of angst between boomers and millennials. But is there a way to get past that and communicate with each other and share lessons, share what works?
With 9/11 and the energy turns towards the war and the invasion, trying to stop the invasion of Iraq, is this just incompatible with what was happening before, at least on the issue base, and then the issue of globalization gets sidelined? And I ask this because I came in, I started professionally as a journalist with sort of lead up into the Iraq War. And I still remember there being protests. I was a Sacramento state legislative correspondent, and I remember an anti-globalization protest that was happening in Sacramento. I remember seeds still being an issue. This is after 9/11, but there's still some remnants of that anti-globalization movement still happening in the early 2000s.
Yes, absolutely. It's almost like, a big tree you might cut down and you think it's gone, but the roots are still there, right? And something's happening and a green shoot comes up years later. And again, there is connective tissue between Occupy and Seattle. I think that's what happened. And those remnants you refer to, I think that sort of is where we see it coming back out. So it didn't completely disappear altogether. But I think what happens is, people are human beings, they have finite energy. And these wars were, as being in the center of all that coverage, just harrowing. And done it with such a speed. 9/11 happens, October, we're in Afghanistan, right? Shortly after that, we're in Iraq. It was dizzying. And so I think organizers were just on their backs, worn out. Yeah. And I think there's also another factor. Lisa Fithian makes this point in the book, and I think it's really, really important. She said, when you're trying to engage the power structures that surround you, mainly sort of government and corporate governance, it's a lot easier to engage them on the issue of globalization because on capitalism, right? On the ills of capitalism, because you can really build large coalitions around that. And it affects a lot of people in a lot of different ways. But when it's an anti-war movement, it's much more difficult because the government can always come at you with this idea called patriotism. And they can always call you anti-patriotic for protesting a war. And you can cut into the ability to build a large coalition that way, right? The government doesn't have such a clearly defined message for the anti-capitalism, or let's say sort of the I don't want to say anti-capitalism, but sort of the protest designed around capitalism. There's not such a clear sort of pushback the way there is a government pushback on anti-war protests. You're being unpatriotic. And so I think that's something that's sort of devastating. It's hard to push back on that. It's hard to build bigger coalitions when that's sort of the argument that's being presented.
And finally, the shutting down of the WTO meeting. You've touched upon the significance, but let me ask you to really dive into that. Did the WTO never get what it wanted afterwards?
It hasn't ever achieved what it thought it was going to achieve 25 years ago in Seattle. And the WTO is really sort of a shell of itself, or what it was sort of wanted to be in the beginning. And I think it's for a lot of reasons. Certainly Seattle deserves some of that credit, right? They really derailed this project early on. And quite frankly, the WTO really never actually recovered. Now, there have been a lot of other factors that have gone into that in the years since. Donald Trump really was no fan of the WTO, largely for xenophobic reasons and isolationist reasons. And
Pat Buchanan was in Seattle in '99.
Yeah, and that's important to know, right? So we had Tom Hayden there and Pat Buchanan, right? A left-right coalition that's unthinkable today, right? But when democracy is on the line, oh wait, guess what? It is on the line again. You have the capacity to build big coalitions because whatever policy debates that Tom Hayden and Pat Buchanan want to have, they can't have them if we don't have democracy. And they recognize that, right? This is a real baseline thing. So, and we're at one of those moments again now. And I think that it's a really sort of hard time to be living in. But there is this silver lining that I think is actually quite true. And that is, if we understand that this election of this year is about democracy, we can put aside policy debates that we really hope to have in the coming years. Right now, we have to defend democracy. And I think that that's what they realized there in Seattle. And just to go back to your original question there too about the WTO, Trump weakened it largely, and Biden has weakened it for a lot of different reasons, not necessarily the Trumpian reasons, but for his own concerns about protecting American manufacturing and jobs and so forth. WTO did not like the sort of subsidies that the Biden administration provided for electric car manufacturers and so forth. So a lot of reasons why the WTO has remained weakened. But I think this push for elevating democracy is one of the main reasons, and that's one of the main issues confronting us right now.
D.W. Gibson has been our guest. He is the author of the book, 1 Week to Change the World, an oral history of the 1999 WTO protests. He's joined us to talk about this protest, which will mark its 25th anniversary this year. D.W. Gibson, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's been a great conversation.